Is there anything you would have done differently?
We reported a true story.
Our colleague Brian Williams is back in Kuwait City tonight after a close call in the skies over Iraq.
Controversial Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh and questions about Kavanaugh's drinking in the past.
Sean Hannity, come on up, Sean Hannity.
Today, Andrew Cuomo is having a moment.
Hello, I'm Chris Firewald.
And I'm Eliana Johnson.
She's in the Milky Way. Welcome to Ink-Stained Wretches, where we break down what's going wrong and what's going right with the American news media. Eliana Johnson, Milky Way, rate it in your candy bar hierarchy. Where do you place the Milky Way?
The Milky Way is pretty low.
Really?
Like rock bottoms.
But you're eating it.
I'm actually eating New York peppermint patty because I opened both and I went for the York peppermint patty, which I think is underrated.
Yeah. YPP is an excellent, excellent candy. No question about it. Underappreciated. I like a Milky Way. Do you prefer a Snickers?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, any other candy bar except Three Musketeers, I prefer to a Milky Way.
Now, my understanding
is
that...
I'll eat it, obviously, because it was the only thing in there.
My understanding is that a Milky Way is a Three Musketeers with caramel, and a Snickers is a Milky Way with peanuts.
No.
No?
No. The whole texture of a Snickers is way more dense than a Milky Way, and it's not.
It's a denser nougat. I'm not gonna lie. I'm not gonna sit here and pretend like it's not a denser nougat in a Snickers bar.
And at Three Musketeers is like eating air.
That's what I like about it.
No.
It's a trifle.
All right.
Wait, last thing.
Yeah.
Almond Joy and Mounds, yay or nay?
They're kind of on the same level as Milky Way.
You'll do it, but you're not going to be stoked about it.
Right. And at like the top of the mountain are the Reese's candy bars. What are those even called that have peanuts?
The Take Five?
No. Hold on, I gotta look it up. No, those are really good.
Whatchamacallit's a great candy.
I don't even think they make them anymore, but like sometimes you can find these Nutrageous.
Oh, the Nutrageous.
Those are so good.
I don't know. It's a lot going on there. There's a lot going on with the Nutrageous. I don't know.
There's nothing wrong with that candy bar. It is so delicious.
Well, I'll tell you that the top of the mountain for me of a generally commercially available candy bar is going to be the Heath bar, or if I can find it, obviously the Score bar. That's where I'm at. That's what I'm about. I'm a minimalist.
That's really good. I just don't like how it sticks in your teeth.
Fair. You know what we do here on Ink-Stained Wretches? We tackle the tough issues. We talk about the big problems facing America today.
Well, it occurred to me that this interview you just did with me about my predilection, my candy predilections, is about as hard-hitting as the one that Stephanie Ruhle did with Kamala Harris on... What was it? Was it Tuesday night?
Yeah. I think that's,
night?
Wednesday. Yeah.
And let's play a couple of clips from that interview.
Or if GOP takes control of the Senate, where do you get the money to do that? Do you still go forward with those plans and borrow?
Well, but we're going to have to raise corporate taxes, and we're going to have to make sure that the biggest corporations and billionaires pay their fair share. That's just it. It's about paying their fair share. But everyone should pay their fair share.
And how do you find that line to make sure corporations are paying their fair share, but they're not leaving our country?
The business leaders who are actually part of the engine of America's economy agree that people should pay their fair share.
How does the federal government cut through all that red tape and get down to, the suburbs of Pittsburgh and say, we're going to have to build some affordable housing here? How do you connect the two?
Looking holistically at the connection between that and housing, and looking holistically at the incentives we in the federal government can create for local and state governments to actually engage in planning in a holistic manner that includes prioritizing affordable housing.
All right. Now, the background of this interview is interesting because the Harris campaign Harris had not done a network interview by herself. She did CNN with Tim Walz, and then she did local news by herself. So this was her first solo network interview. And over last weekend, Stephanie Ruhle went on Bill Maher's show, and she got in a debate with Bret Stephens, who was the other guest on the show, the New York Times columnist. And she said, well, how can you say Harris is so bad? Are you going to vote for Trump? And he said, no, I'm not voting for Trump, but I think she should be able to sit down and do an interview and clarify what her policy positions are. And Ruhle mocked him and said, well, introduce me to your real estate agent in Nirvana because I want to live there and we live in the real world, and she's not running for perfect. She's running for president, and there's no reason she should really have to get specific. And fast forward 48 hours, this is the person the Harris campaign says she's going to sit down and do an interview with. But Chris, you have mentioned before that you think that friendly interviews are the places where candidates slip up.
Yep.
And I thought this was a good example of that. What did you think?
No, I think that's true. I think Stephanie Ruhle deserves credit for asking about the economy, asking like actual questions. So I don't want to make it seem like it was a Drew Barrymore interview, but it was obviously
or an Oprah interview.
Right. And by the way, Oprah's a lifestyle brand, not a journalist, and we know, and Oprah put it in a campaign context. She was not abashed about what she was doing. But Stephanie Ruhle was more and better than that. But it was obviously a very friendly setting, that the host had disclaimed, as you say, 48 hours earlier to say that it would be that way. I think it is inescapable. Well, maybe I'll put it this way. I knew that Kamala Harris had a tenuous grasp on economics and economic policy before the interview. I listened to her speech in Pittsburgh, and it was, preposterous. The way that she talks about, I probably best said, I have never encountered two more economically illiterate people running for high office at the same time as these two, Trump and Harris. Really bad. Really, really bad. And Harris is really, really bad at talking about it because she's obviously unsteady and doesn't understand how the economy works or economics work. And maybe the simplest way I can put it is, I don't know that she knows what she believes. I don't know that she knows what she believes about economics. And consequently, since she lacks a worldview and she's trying to just tell people what they want to hear and what will be safe, she sounds incomprehensible.
I just want to read a couple of quotes from this interview that Harris said. One of them was, some of the work is going to be through what we do in terms of giving benefits and assistance to state and local governments around transit dollars and looking holistically at the connection between that and housing and looking holistically at the incentives we in the federal government can create for local and state governments to actually engage in planning in a holistic manner that includes prioritizing affordable housing.
Baby. Wow.
That's how she's going to tackle the housing problem.
Holistic.
With a lot of holistic solutions.
We're going to give the economy a coffee enema and everything's going to work itself out.
And then it was telling that this occurred on Chris Hayes' show on MSNBC. And then Ruhle did an interview with Hayes to talk about the interview. And she said, well, if you didn't think her answers were clear, that's because the issues aren't clear either. The issues are complicated, sort of, making excuses for her. But one thing that surprised me about this, interviews are clearly not her forte. And I'm actually not sure if it's because this interview was friendly that she was bad, because she's been bad in all of the interviews she's done. They just all have been friendly. I think she'd also be bad in a hard-hitting interview, is that the New York Times started covering this. And I'm not sure why it happened after this interview as opposed to after any of the other ones. And they did it not once, but twice. They had a piece yesterday morning, 3 takeaways from Harris's interview on MSNBC. And the Times wrote, in her discussion with a friendly interviewer, the vice president again presented herself as a champion of the middle class and hit many of the same themes from her pro-business economic speech earlier in the day. She largely avoided direct questions about how she would govern and why some voters remained fond of former President Donald J. Trump's stewardship of the economy. They hit her for having roundabout answers to open-ended questions and for her failure to address the question of how she would enact her plans if Democrats lose the Senate. And they noted that a hard-hitting Harris interview is still yet to come. And then today in the paper, we get Harris has a lot of strengths. Giving interviews isn't one of them. And the paper notes, in her dizzying ascent to the top of the Democratic ticket, Ms. Harris has proved to be a disciplined and effective debater and a tireless campaigner, nimble and energetic in rallies. But one-on-one televised interviews with journalists have long been a weakness in her political arsenal. She often winds her way slowly toward an answer, leaning on jargon and rehearsed turns of phrase, using language that is sometimes derided as word salad, but might be better described as a meringue.
Yeah, exactly. Piffle.
So why do you think this is coming
Three
now?
Musketeers. Well, I mean, because now she did an interview, right? She allowed the issue of whether she would be interviewed or not interviewed to fester for 6 weeks. She did an interview, and when she did it, it was piffle. And I think it's probably as simple as that, right?
Well, she did them before. She did one with Dana Bash along with Tim Walz, and she did another with this local reporter in Pennsylvania. And then she was on stage with the National Association of Black Journalists, and she performed just the same way she did with Stephanie Ruhle. So I'm sort of puzzled why the Times got so negative about her now when her performance has been the same. But
one was
nice to see it.
One was local, one was in tandem with her running mate, and the other one was at a forum setting. So this was the first, one-on-one primetime television interviews. It was the first of its kind, and in its own way, the questioning was more challenging. Things got testy with the local interviewer
and with the black journalists.
But I think there was more. She was called to offer a little more substance in this case than she was in the others, and she was very light on that. I think for Harris, there would be a lot of merit in going on with, I don't know, is it Hugh Hewitt? Is it somebody at Fox? I don't know who it would be, but to go on and have an adversarial interview, right? Show that she's willing to take it. And then that actually makes the word salad a lot easier, right? So somebody's going to come after her, get in her face, push her on stuff. She can be the person who she was on the debate stage would be much better in an interview than somebody who's given these open-ended questions where she ends up in the Three Musketeers category.
Well, there is talk of her doing a 60 Minutes interview, both candidates doing a 60 Minutes interview, and that could be sort of cataclysmic.
Well, it depends on, speaking of 60 Minutes interviews, did you see Leslie Stahl interview Lena Khan, the chairwoman of the Federal Trade Commission? Wow. So Lena Khan is a hugely controversial figure who has admirers ranging from
J.D. Vance
to typical Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren kinds of folks. She is this foe of big business, and she's going to do all this stuff. And she has wildly expanded the power of the Federal Trade Commission, this little known, typically not that influential federal agency. And she's got big dreams. And the commission itself has turned into a suckhole of disaster, and everybody's quit, and it's been a mess. and it's very controversial. She does this interview with Leslie Stahl, and you would have thought that Lena Khan was Mother Teresa. It was the most flattering, gauzy, and the idea that people were opposed to her in good faith was discounted. It wasn't even considered. And I think 60 Minutes, it ain't Mike Wallace, right? And I think we've talked before about Steve Kroft and his Obama nuzzling in 2008 to 2016.
He was nuzzling some other things too.
Well, okay. All right, fair. But if you get the right setup at 60 Minutes and it's a walk and talk, long form kind of profile, I think Kamala Harris would do just fine in that. If she gets half as friendly a treatment as Lena Khan got on 60 Minutes, she'll do just fine.
Well, it could be another Stephanie Ruhle. That was a very friendly.
But friendly and edited is different from friendly and live.
Oh, okay. Well, that's interesting. I think the Ruhle thing was taped too, actually.
Well, but it wasn't cut, right? So what you get on 60 Minutes is sometimes it's a snippet of the interview, and then other times we're walking by the Mcdonald's where she used to work, and we're here with her husband, and we're blah, 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 blah. That's edited.
I take your point and your suggestion that they would edit to make her look good.
Yeah, and if you're Trump, you're not going to get as good an editing job, but he should probably still do it anyway.
Totally. All right, Chris, we have another New York Times piece. They're getting a lot of attention this week. Two New York Times pieces. The second one you're going to have to talk about because I couldn't bring myself to read it. A really interesting story about the relationship between Kamala Harris and Laurene Powell Jobs, Steve Jobs' widow.
I include this because we've talked about Laurene Powell Jobs and her role in the media at the Atlantic and other places and what she's done. And the champion that she has had the champion that Kamala Harris has had in Laurene Powell Jobs. And I found it very interesting and thought it was quite telling. And if we're looking for, I think this is frequently missed, if we're looking for where to place Kamala Harris on the ideological spectrum, I think Silicon Valley is a pretty good place to put her, right? I think if we're going to say what is her ideological or worldview origin, I think mainstream Silicon Valley is probably about right.
Well, this is also an interesting media story. The Times story gets at how close these two are and how long they have been friends, and that Jobs was a key player in circulating research and polling that pushed Joe Biden off the ticket, and that truly they are intimates.
Yes.
Harris and Powell Jobs. At the same time, Laurene Powell Jobs' Emerson Collective owns The Atlantic, and she's an investor in several other center-left media outlets, and also this sort of fake news series of local websites on the left called Courier Newsroom. So is The Atlantic going to run hard-hitting anti-Harris pieces?
Well, I bet it wouldn't have whoever owned it, but no.
Right? And what I just find interesting is that there isn't a ton written about that.
No, that's a good point. That's
she's a real player in media, and there was actually talk in this piece about her potentially having a role in the administration, which is something she didn't rule out. Chris, so this next piece, you flagged the long, strange saga of Kamala Harris and Kimberly Guilfoyle, and I'm sorry I couldn't click. So please,
let me tell you,
regale me.
So Kimberly Guilfoyle, Donald Trump Jr.'s longtime fiance, and her crossing paths with Kamala Harris when Kimberly Guilfoyle was trying to get on board at the San Francisco DA's office and Kamala Harris being there. Kimberly Guilfoyle, who would go on to be married to Gavin Newsom, and just the entanglement of these two women over the past 25 years. And fascinating, interesting, well-written, well-researched, and another reflection of how little relatively we know about Kamala Harris, especially at least compared to Donald Trump. There's nothing new to be said about Donald Trump. People will believe anything. They'll believe things about Donald Trump that aren't even true, good and bad. Donald Trump is a discovered country. He was fascinating for a long time, but he is a known, he is a known entity. Kamala Harris, we know very little, relatively speaking, about her and her life, given as evidence that you can unearth this story like, wow, Donald Trump's son, who's a big part of his campaign, is engaged to be married to a woman who was once Kamala Harris's workplace nemesis. Whoa. And I just found it interesting and illustrative and spoke to Harris, the undiscovered country.
Don't worry, Chris. I'm sure all of the investigative resources that our major newspapers are devoting to digging into Kamala Harris's past, you'll know her fully by the time November comes around.
Well, here's one. I mean, that is one.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure, all of the top investigative reporters at the Journal and the Times and the Post, they're all on her past.
Well, they did this one. So I'm going to give them credit for doing this one.
All right. Let me know when there's a damaging, and when they uncover anything negative about her, you can flag it for me.
Okay, you got it.
On the Trump campaign, earlier today, we are recording on Friday, the Justice Department indicted 3 Iranian operatives for hacking the Trump campaign. So they unsealed criminal charges Friday against these 3. And also for disseminating the stolen information to media organizations. The latest action, this is according to the Associated Press, coupled with sanctions and rewards for information leading to the hackers' capture. They're in Iran, so I'm not sure that that's going to be forthcoming, is the latest U.S. government effort to call out what's seen as Iran's attempts to interfere in the election by damaging Trump and sowing general chaos. It comes as Iran has also been accused of threatening the lives of Trump and former officials, and U.S.-Iran relations remain especially tense, with Israel fighting Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon. The defendants' own words made clear that they were attempting to undermine former President Trump's campaign in advance of the 2024 U.S. presidential election. We know that Iran is continuing with its brazen efforts to stoke discord, erode confidence in the U.S. electoral process, and advance its malign activities, Attorney General Merrick Garland said at a news conference announcing the charges.
Now, what I find interesting in all this, and there's a Semafor piece here about how the Iranian hack continued into even last week. Ben Smith has that. And the interesting part to me, and the point of discussion here has been, when Russia hacked Hillary Clinton's emails, or the DNC's emails, in 2020, those went public. They got published. This time, the hacked materials from Trump's campaign have not been published anywhere. And there is some complaining going on among Democrats about a double standard, and that the press was happy to report on hacked emails about Hillary Clinton, but not happy to report on hacked emails or data about Donald Trump from a foreign adversary. And I have to say, I was in the minority in 2016 of people who said, I don't think we should be publishing hacked materials. I think I think we can't be sure that it's true. I think that it's an incentive for people to commit crimes, to get stuff. And again, if what was revealed was criminal or, the serious misfeasance or malfeasance, you'd say, well, maybe we need to report this out and see if we can confirm it. But if basically what you're reporting out, which was a lot of what was being reported out of the emails that were stolen from Hillary Clinton or from the DNC, was what? Just embarrassing stuff, right? Stuff people were saying about other Democrats, stuff that people wouldn't want to have published in public, but very understandably might write in an email. And it was published. And now this is not being published. And I have to say that I'm glad. I'm glad this is not being published. I'm glad people are not repeating the mistakes of 2016. I understand why Democrats feel that this is unfair and that Donald Trump should get what he wanted. But he got what he wanted in 2016 about the DNC hacked emails. And he's getting what he wants now, which is that his own emails are not being published. And I understand that. But I still think that if we learned anything from 2016, it should be to be skeptical about hacked materials and foreign interference.
Well, Matt Continetti and I talked about this when he was on the podcast. And I said then that I believed that if there were something really newsworthy in these hacked materials, the news organizations would publish it. And that has since been validated by none other than Judd Legum, the left-wing blogger who received these materials and said he had decided not to publish them because there was nothing actually that newsworthy in the materials. And I believe the New York Times has said something along the same lines, that it did not meet the bar for publishing hacked materials, which is pretty high, they indicated. And that's the reason they haven't been published. I still do believe that it's less an act out of principle than there's nothing that great or newsworthy in these, and that's why. But it is a combination of the two. There's a little bit more reluctance, but also I don't think this hack produced all that much good stuff.
But yes, and the 2016 hack didn't produce that much great stuff either.
I
right?
think there was like pretty interesting and salacious stuff in
well,
there.
It was embarrassing, right? What people were saying, but it wasn't newsy, right? John Podesta thinks this about that. So-and-so doesn't like so-and-so. And I may be forgetting some big piece of news that came out, but I thought it was mostly just, it had a WikiLeaks flavor to it, which is things that are true that people say in private but wouldn't say in public. And I thought a lot of the stuff that got scraped out of the Russian hack of the DNC was pretty low qualities.
All right. What do we have next?
Excellence, I'm sure.
Oh, the Semafor report here that the Trump hack...
I just mentioned that. Next, then, is why is J.D. Vance hanging out with Tucker Carlson? And I include this to this point about when you have weak parties, who fills the role of the parties? And the media fills the role of the parties. And what is in the interest of the media is not always in the interest of the parties. Frequently, they are divergent. J.D. Vance should be doing a lot of things. But one thing he should not be doing is going on tour with Tucker Carlson. It will not win him a single vote. It will not get the Republicans anything. And on a tour that includes Roseanne Barr saying that she's not kidding that Democrats and elites eat children and drink their blood because they're really vampires. And Tucker Carlson, who most recently, or of note most recently, entertained the idea that maybe Hitler wasn't the real villain of the Second World War, and maybe the Holocaust was really just a problem that they were overwhelmed with prisoners of war and couldn't handle the flow. Maybe the Holocaust was a logistics problem that you would go on to his tour. And the reason that J.D. Vance had to go on Tucker Carlson's tour is that Tucker Carlson is very powerful in the constituency that made J.D. Vance the vice presidential nominee. J.D. Vance owed his Senate seat to Tucker Carlson and probably in substantial part his elevation to the national ticket. So he couldn't snub Tucker Carlson. What I wonder, though, is why Tucker Carlson didn't say to J.D. Vance, hey, you don't need this heat right now. I appreciate you. We can ask Roseanne Barr to do two, right? We can get RFK Jr. We can get somebody who is not required to be appealing to mainstream persuadable people to come do this. You don't have to do it. But he did not. and he had J.D. Vance come to his thing. And I thought that spoke powerfully to the distortion in which media dictates partisan electioneering activities in ways that are good for the media and bad for the parties.
Well, here's the question. J.D. Vance may not gain votes from appearing with Tucker. Now, had he pulled out of the event and said, I really don't agree with, like Churchill. I don't agree with this event that he had.
Well, that wouldn't have been in his interest either. But it definitely would have been in Republicans' interest for Tucker Carlson to say to J.D. Vance an email, in an unhacked email, in an email or text unobtained by others. Love you, man. Just go out there and win. Don't worry about my tour. We're just out here trying to make a buck. We'll catch you after you win. Good luck. And J.D. Vance did not need to publicly disavow Tucker. He already declined to do that. But the idea that he would do this and that Carlson would want him to do this speaks to that distortion between parties and media.
It's uncomfortable.
It's uncomfortable, and it's the I think a reasonable question about J.D. Vance, and one that Donald Trump probably asks himself is, what does J.D. Vance want? And does J.D. Vance want Donald Trump to win the presidency, or which does J.D. Vance want more? For Donald Trump to win the presidency or to one day be president himself? And those two things are not mutually exclusive, certainly, but they are in tension at some points.
Well, I don't see how JD was supposed to get out of this appearing with Tucker if Tucker is not going to let him out of it, which that's not very Tucker. I don't see how that was supposed to be carried out without hurting the campaign.
Well, I would say that if the MAGA base is so demanding that J.D. Vance conjuring a scheduling excuse to not appear on the same bill as Roseanne Barr, if they can't let him off the hook on that, then they're going to lose anyway, because that's psychotic.
Do you think Tucker would, J.D. Vance could offer that? The question is whether Tucker would turn it against him, and who controls the audience and the voters. And I don't know.
Well, that's my point. That's my point.
Yeah.
That's exactly my point, which is you don't need to, if I don't know there isn't a Tucker Carlson of the left, but let's say that, I don't know who that would be, whoever the fringiest kind of figure who's still popular on the left is. But if that person started demanding that Kamala Harris come and do, or Tim Walz come and do an interview, and if Tim Walz said no, that person would then attack him, it would be a disaster. And that should speak to who should be making determinations about the viability of a campaign and the direction of a campaign. Not somebody who's trying to sell tickets for a tour, but somebody who's trying to win an election.
Should we talk Eric Adams?
Oh my gosh. New York, never change.
I mean, if you're going to sell out, sell out for something better than some first class plane tickets?
Yeah, I didn't get the whole inventory. Tell me the story.
From what I can tell, he was selling out to foreign countries, the most prominent of which is Turkey, for travel perks for him and his girlfriend, which included first-class airfare, stays in fancy hotels, etc., some campaign donations, but there's no one, big gift. It wasn't like he got $3 million.
Well, what is it that
it's an assortment of small things like that.
What is it that the mayor of New York supposedly can do for Turkey? I guess I don't understand that.
Well, he had signed off on a consulate of some sort that the Turks wanted in New York, and he allegedly pressed the fire department to sign off on the inspection despite violations of, various rule codes, so that Erdogan could come to the city and show off this consulate I think it's a consulate, but, some sort of Turkish government building in New York during the UN General Assembly.
I get it.
And the Turks, by the way, they have people everywhere in the States. Like, they are big
ask
on
Michael
this.
Flynn. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
And so that was what the Turks wanted. And in exchange, they were funneling campaign donations to Adams. But again, it wasn't tons and tons of money, using straw donors to get those donations to him and offering him these travel perks, which, I mean, Turkey's nice. But like, dude, it would take a lot more to get me to sell out.
Well, Donald Trump has a theory of why this has all happened. It's because Eric Adams dared to complain about migrants in the United States, in New York City, and that he broke with the Biden Justice Department, and that they're punishing him for thought crime. And I think it was Punchbowl today had a litany of all of the people in public life currently facing charges, facing ethics violations, facing all of this stuff. And I have not heard the arguments. I have not heard Eric Adams make the argument that Donald Trump made on his behalf, that he was a prisoner of conscience, victimized for his views. But I do think, I mean, you've got, I think Henry Cuellar down in Texas is facing charges. Bob Menendez just is
the gold medalist.
The gold medalist. And the list goes on and on and on. And public corruption is always pretty common. It's a fact of life in any free society or any non-free society. But I wonder if we keep having public corruption prosecutions that don't work, what will the effect of that be, right? If Eric Adams gets charged and if somehow he slips the noose here, it was good that Menendez did not, right? Menendez looked like he was going to get away with it all again. He had been under investigation for, a decade or whatever, and had all these scrapes with the law and ethically. And it seems like he will not escape this time. But it's not healthy for a society when people in positions of power do bad things. It's even worse for a society when they break the law or are accused of breaking the law and get away with it. And I just wonder, when we look at the prosecutions of Donald Trump, which now seem silly, right? It seems silly. He was convicted in New York, but maybe he'll get sentenced, maybe he won't. The Georgia case was turned into a debacle, and the federal prosecutions are still there, but held off until after the election and all that stuff. And I just wonder, what are the consequences of that for a society if the people who are in powerful positions are accused of wrongdoing and get away with it?
Chris, we would be remiss if before we hit our sports section, we should talk about Ta-Nehisi, not quite sure how you pronounce his first name, his reemergence as an anti-Israel radical after traveling for 10 days to Israel and not Gaza. So he's the cover story of New York Magazine and has a forthcoming book about this, in which he furthers the case that the Palestinians are the black people of the Middle East and the Israelis are the bad white people. Mm-hmm. So New York,
settler colonials.
Yeah, the New York Magazine writes, Coates traveled to the region on a 10-day trip in the summer of 2023. It was so emotional, he told me. I would dream about being back there for weeks. That it was complicated. Complicated was how people had described slavery and then segregation. It's complicated, he said, when you want to take something from somebody. The book is strongest, and this is New York Mag, the book is strongest when its aperture is narrow. There's no mention of the fact that Israel is bombarded by terrorist groups set on the state's annihilation. There's no discussion of the intifadas and the failed negotiations between Israeli and Palestinian leaders going back decades. There is even no mention of Gaza because Coates was unable to visit the region after the October 7th attack, and he did not want to report on a place he hadn't seen for himself. This is Coates saying, people were like, Gaza is so much worse, he told me, so much worse. What there is instead is a picture of the intolerable cruelty and utter desperation that could lead to on October 7th.
Wow. Jeez Louise.
It is a very, very long piece in which Coates makes the case that he feels very misled by all of the people he has been around in the mainstream media, including the people he worked with at the Atlantic, which he says are, whom he says are too Zionist, and that this is a black and white issue. He says he returned and sought out Rashid Khalidi, who is the radical Palestinian activist professor at Columbia, the successor of Edward Said, and learned with him about, the horrors of Israel and of the Zionist movement. And he says, Israel's a settler colonialist nation. And there's an amusing passage in the New York Mag piece, and I'll just read it. There is undeniable power in the time-collapsing, globe-spanning pattern Coates establishes. When he goes back to the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, however, the book is called The Message. The Message ventures onto shakier ground, becoming entangled in complex academic battles that his first-person reporting elides. In an attempt to establish that Israel was started as a colonial project, Coates marshals substantial primary documentation showing the colonial motivations of the early Zionists, from Theodore Herzl, the father of the movement, to militant extremists such as Zev Jabotinsky, who called for an iron wall between Jews and Palestinians. But attempting to squeeze Israel into a classic colonial mold invites some convincing objections. As Adam Kirsch, a literary critic and frequent contributor to The Atlantic, points out in his new book on settler colonialism, the original Zionist settlers, including those who fled the pogroms in Europe before the Holocaust, did not have a mother country in whose name they could extract resources or claim sovereignty, nor a country to which they could ultimately return. And as people expelled from the region long ago, they had claims to indigeneity themselves. Even Khalidi, who is firm that Israel was a settler colonial project, said that such analogies can only go so far. Usually, settler colonial projects are extensions of the people and of the sovereignty of the mother country, he said. Zionism is an independent national movement, so it's different to everything that came before.
But other than that.
So I'm paying attention to that, but then I saw this piece in Jewish Insider this morning about Coates' father, who I knew nothing about. And this Jewish Insider piece was really interesting. The headline is, Paul Coates, father of journalist Ta-Nehisi Coates, republishing anti-Semitic screed, The Jewish Onslaught.
Oh, boy.
So Paul Coates is the founder of something called Black Classic Press, and he's slated to receive an award from the National Book Foundation for his lifetime service to the literary community. And Matthew Castle at Jewish Insider writes that Black Classic Press is dedicated to unearthing obscure and significant works by and about people of African descent, and that the company has been the focus of renewed attention as Paul Coates prepares to accept a Lifetime Achievement Award from the National Book Foundation. And then Castle says, but even as Coates has been celebrated for nurturing such contemporary authors as Walter Mosley and reissuing works by W.E.B. Du Bois, among other luminaries, his company has also recently chosen to spotlight an anti-Semitic screed that seeks to uphold a widely discredited conspiracy theory alleging Jewish domination of the Atlantic slave trade. Called The Jewish Onslaught, the book was self-published in 1993 by Tony Martin, a former professor of Africana Studies at Wellesley College who had faced backlash for approvingly teaching an infamous tract from the Nation of Islam purporting to show that Jews played a disproportionate role in the slave trade, a claim historians have dismissed as factually inaccurate. Black Classic Press makes no mention of Martin's commitment to propagating an anti-Semitic trope in a laudatory blurb on its website, saying he became embroiled in controversy over his classroom use of a book detailing the well-documented Jewish role in the Atlantic slave trade.
Uh-oh.
So, apple and tree.
Well, I am including here Brother Jonah Goldberg's piece on Ta-Nehisi Coates and the addiction to resistance, and is very good. Not surprisingly, it's very good. And Jonah makes a really, really good point, which is we live in a time where victimhood is cherished and lionized. And we believe that to be part of the resistance is noble and laudatory, whereas to be part of the mainstream or the whole, to be part of the power structure, to use the language of resistance thinking, is bad and sold out and not good. And Jonah's point, and one that he's made often, which Coates does not understand, obviously, is you can have a bad resistance. You can have a good resistance. You can have a bad power structure. You can have a good power structure. These things are all different. And doing a one-to-one comparison to say, Israel is the same as Nazi Germany, or Israel is the same as South Africa in the apartheid days, is dumb, right? Israel is Israel, and it's different from other places and other things and other times, and it should be examined on its own, not smashed down into fitting some Marxian worldview about this is what people are like here, and therefore always that way. And Jonah's piece was spot on and very good.
Ding, dang, do. That brings us to our sports section.
You love it.
Where there was a wonderful piece in The Atlantic by my former colleague, Charles Fain Lehman. And Chris, it brought me back to, I'm not sure if we had the conversation on the show, but do you remember when I was preparing to go on the Chris Wallace show on CNN, and one of their topics was sports betting, or how they were going to advertise, whether they should or shouldn't advertise in football stadiums.
Okay.
The NFL, whether the NFL should partner with DraftKings or something. Anyhow, I of course knew nothing about it. And so I was sitting there and I was like, what do you think? And you were hard no on that. So that's why this article caught my attention, other than that Charles wrote it. He's a former Beacon reporter who's now at the Manhattan Institute, and he's just exceptionally smart. So the title of the piece is "Legalizing Sports Gambling Was a Huge Mistake. The Evidence is Convincing the Betting Industry is Ruining Lives." And Charles is a data nerd, and he writes that now that sports betting has been legal for long enough, we can study it. And he writes, alarming patterns have started to emerge. 2 recent working papers look at the economic impacts of legalization. One by Northwestern University's Scott Baker and colleagues finds that legal sports gambling depletes household savings. Specifically, for every $1 spent on betting, households put $2 less into investment accounts. States see big increases in the risk of overdrafting a bank account or maxing out a credit card. These effects are strongest among already precarious households. A second paper from the economists Brett Hollenbeck of UCLA and Poet Larson and David Proserpio of the University of Southern California tells a similar story. Looking specifically at online sports gambling, they find that legalization increases the risk that a household goes bankrupt by 25 to 30% and increases debt delinquency. These problems seem to concentrate among young men living in low-income counties, further evidence that those most hurt by sports gambling are the least well off.
So my nuanced thing on this, I think sports gambling ought to be legal. I think you ought to be able to do whatever you want with your money. And I think that's fine. But I don't think the state should interfere. Where I have a problem is when the state encourages sports gambling and sees it as a revenue source. And instead of saying people are going to do it and we're going to tax the revenue from it like we would tax the revenue from selling rutabagas or whatever else, or even at a higher rate, but they get in the business of, much like with lottery games, promoting because it's good for them because they can spend more and tax less. And then we get to the next part, which is, what is the matter with these networks and these leagues that they so blithely talk about and encourage sports gambling? I listen to on golf, I'm sorry, if we're going to say it correctly, we have to call it by its correct name, the golf. When I'm watching the golf and I hear sports gambling advertised on the golf, when I hear NFL announcers and college football announcers talk about how to lay down your parlays and how they're betting and all of this stuff. And look, I don't think there is a difference really between playing the stock market and betting on sports. It's all gambling. It's whatever. That's fine. But to valorize and make it a light matter, oh, whatever. So as this piece points out, you have all these young men who, and we have a lot of clinical research to back this up, that young men are idiots, right? No one is stupider in American life than a 16 to 25-year-old man. I know it's true because I was one. Bad impulse control, bad decisions, it's happening. It's going down. And the idea that these people would pretend like it's nothing and that it's fine. You know, I don't want to tar Jim Nantz with this, but here's Jim Nantz, this august figure of American sports broadcasting. And if he's talking about, and I don't know that he is, but let's say he was, if he's talking about where to lay down your bets, he's legitimizing something like that. Now, would he say the same thing about liquor? Right? And I would just say that if you're talking about sports gambling and you're in public or you're the government, don't say anything that you wouldn't say about hard liquor because it's about the same stuff, right? Some people handle it fine. Some people don't. It comes with a lot of dangers. It deals with people who have addictive personalities and impulse control problems like young men. Be careful. Show a little dignity. Show a little shame about it. And it really bothers me, and I know it shouldn't, but it really bothers me to see this treated as it's nothing when it's really something.
Chris, you're going to have to take this next one.
Oh, I love this piece so much. It was found by the incomparable Nate Moore. New York Times, this is maybe our most Times-heavy episode ever.
Totally.
But the New York Times sent a reporter to go to the Chicago White Sox end of the season. And Chicago White Sox, as we're recording this, I think tonight they will they have their first opportunity tonight to break the Mets' longstanding record of the worst season in baseball of 120 losses in a season. And this reporter went out to Chicago, went out to Comiskey, and hung out with the handful of fans who are still showing up and still going out there. A guy named Meat something, I forget his name, but these colorful characters and the scene there. And it was just a brilliant piece of sports writing. And what a great scene piece. It could have been my favorite if I didn't love my favorite so much.
Okay. Good tease.
I know. That's it. When TV, we call that a deep tease.
Chris, that brings us to our obsessions of the week. Where we break down the stories that we can't get out of our heads. And Chris, never has it been truer. Well, I don't want to exaggerate, but I actually am obsessing about this story. In late August, long wind up for this. My obsession is about a CNN segment this week. And in late August, the Beacon did a triple bylined, very careful report on Kamala Harris's invocation of her time as a McDonald's employee. Yeah. And that report noted that she had never mentioned this part of her biography until she ran for president in 2019. And even then, it wasn't a central part of, she didn't make it a central part of her biography on the campaign trail. And that changed this time around. So we went back and looked at the biographies that have been written about her and the 2 books she has written, and she makes no mention of it. We reached out to those who have written biographies about her, and the one person who replied said that he was not aware that she had had this job. And one interesting thing is that the campaign's claims about the job have changed. So they had said she had this job to work her way through college. And she did not work her way through college. She was the daughter of two well-off people. And so they were actually filming an ad where they made that claim and had to clean it up. And when the Beacon reached out for comment, they did not reply, but all of a sudden a story appeared in Politico about the campaign cleaning up this claim. So there's a lot of, it's interesting. It's interesting for somebody to run for president and make a central fact of their biography, something that they've never said before, particularly someone who's been on the national stage for many years. So Trump, of course, has become, he's talked about this a lot now. And the source of his claims are, of course, the Beacon story. And of course, Trump is exaggerating this claim, saying she lied about it, she lied about it, she lied about it. Now, we don't know that by any means, but we know that there's reason to be skeptical of her claim, which is all the Beacon report said. So CNN does a segment on this on Caitlin Collins' show on Tuesday evening. And I want to play some clips from the segment. And their segment, they never mention the Beacon report, but their segment is about why is Donald Trump so obsessed with lying about Kamala Harris's time at McDonald's. So I want to play a couple of clips from that. Let's hear it.
It's not clear, but maybe it strikes such a chord. Trump has always been a big McDonald's customer himself. Of course, no one can forget the picture in 2016 after he clinched the Republican nomination and had a Big Mac and fries on his plane to celebrate. CNN's chief media analyst, Brian Stelter, joins me now. And Brian, obviously, when you listen to as many Trump rallies as I have and his comments, you kind of know his roadmap and where he's going and where a question is or what he's about to say. The McDonald's thing has become a recurring theme, an obsession of his since Harris became the nominee, that he's just accusing her of not telling the truth.
Maybe because it does seem like a vulnerability insofar as this is relatable for Harris. I remember the first time Harris put this in a campaign ad about a month ago, and I immediately messaged a Harris spokeswoman and said, I did not know this fact about her. It turns out she had shared it before. She had mentioned it before while running in 2020 and then as vice president. But I think for many Americans, myself included, it was a new piece of information and a very relatable one.
Was this something that was started? I mean, is it able to even... Is it just online that people said it's not true?
I think a bunch of kind of pro-Trump commentators started this idea, not saying definitively that she made it up, just raising the question. And I think we see this oftentimes when it comes to Trump because of his record of fact-free claims. What his allies try to say is everybody else is making up stuff too, right? Everybody's a liar, so it's not a big deal when he fibs. I think that might be what's going on here with McDonald's. But now, as you said, it's a little bit of an obsession for him to say he's going to go and work there. And I hope he does it. I think it's a brilliant idea for Donald Trump to go and work the French fry machine. I will volunteer to come and help him on the hamburger line.
And I just came away from that thinking, if you were a viewer of CNN and you didn't know any of the background of this, you would think that Donald Trump took conspiracy theory claims from deluded MAGA trolls on the internet and is running with them, as opposed to, the Harris campaign and Kamala Harris herself has said these things. There was a report about it that made these claims, and Donald Trump is now exaggerating them on the campaign trail. This segment actually would not have informed you in the least. And I think distorted the facts of the matter to make Harris look better and Trump look worse. So that's my obsession.
I believe it. I believe it. All right. My obsession is AP headline, their churches no longer feel safe. Now Nicaraguans are taking their worship home. And it's a chilling, depressing story about how the regime in Nicaragua is systematically persecuting Christians in a way that we seldom have heard about outside of China, North Korea, the old Soviet Union. And I included first to praise the Associated Press for running it, but I also included to say that when we think about, and this is just a point of time, when we think about what's wrong with the world, the answer is people. The answer is people. People are great and they're the best, but people are what's wrong with the world. And people do not change. The human nature does not change. Christianity, properly understood, is an extraordinarily radical message and a departure from most of human history and human philosophy. And it's problematic if you want to have an oppressor state. And I include this because it's real. It continues to happen. And American Christians who complain about persecution in the United States.
All right, that brings us to my favorite time of the week, which is reader mail. Chris had to jet out early, so I am piloting the rest of this thing on my own. Our first letter is from R.A. Watman, and the letter says, so much fun seeing the two of you back on YouTube. I love podcasts, but sometimes it's just fun seeing the people who are talking. Chris, you are so right about journalists no longer educating us, and I'd say the same thing about politicians. Too many voters don't educate themselves, and then they're vulnerable to anything they're told. Also, it's not all those snacks. If it's not all those snacks, then what is causing our obesity problem? I do remember eating Pop-Tarts, sugar-coated cereal, and those TV dinners. One of my favorites was fried chicken and mashed potatoes. Was it the people were more active? I've often read that corn syrup is a problem. It's used as sweetener in almost everything. Almost no one was obese when I was growing up in the 60s and probably most of the 70s. It's actually surprising for me to look back at high school photos. I graduated in 1970 and no one was obese. What is the explanation? Oh man, that I'm sure is a super complicated question, but I do feel like portion sizes has a lot to do with it, and the general availability of, I guess, processed food. I mean, I'm always told just eat things with simple ingredients, which I think Pop-Tarts and all of those things aren't, but I know that's not some radical change from the 60s, so I don't really know. But I do think portion sizes has a lot to do with it, which you always notice if you go to foreign countries. I certainly do. I'm like, why is my glass of wine like a droplet? And our next letter is from Peter Gears, who sends a Washington Post piece that was truly disturbing. The headline of which is, Fridgescaping is everywhere, but is it safe? The social media trend is taking refrigerator organization to a whole new level. Here are the pros and cons. And what's pictured here is not desirable at all. It is a refrigerator filled with like Halloween decorations, and it looks like flowers and just like tchotchkes, a refrigerator filled with tchotchkes. And the article says, Fridgescaping, making the inside of your refrigerator worthy of a star spot on your Instagram or TikTok feed, has been all over social media lately. Yes, it includes the obligatory color-coordinated items stored in clear containers and condiments and beverages lined up in neat rows, but some people are taking it a step farther. Think vases of flowers, fresh fruit and decorative bowls, and framed photos perched on shelves. Let me just say, the refrigerator that is pictured in this article isn't that at all. It looks like a mess, and all I want is like a perfectly organized refrigerator that has no other extra items, and I have no interest in this whole fridgescaping thing that just adds extra things to your refrigerator. So the letter from Peter says, I appreciate there are pros and cons. This piece is fair and balanced, but he says, further signs of cultural decline, something only childless cat ladies have time to do. As a father of 3 with 2 boys, I'm thankful if the door is closed and there's food in the fridge. Lord, Peter, I kind of sort of agree with you. I mean, sure. But I want my fridge like neat and tidy too. Not that mine is, but I certainly don't want any flowers or tchotchkes or Halloween decorations in there. So yeah, this is not happening for me at all. And that brings us to Chris's favorite time of the week that he is absent for, but I'm going to do it anyway. Where we flag our favorite items. And mine, consistent with our New York Times heavy episode, was a New York Times piece on the Israeli raid in Syria that kicked off Israel's campaign and now basically all-out war against Hezbollah. But it actually started in Syria, although when this happened, it was on September 8th, and we didn't know what was to come, which was this broader offensive against Hezbollah. And this piece details the Israeli raid targeting a Hezbollah facility that manufactures these high-tech missiles that is located in a Syrian town 30 miles outside of Lebanon that the Israelis have wanted to target and take out for a long time. And the Times writes, Israeli intelligence had information about the location of the guard posts and the layout of the facility. After the guards were killed that Sunday night, so they had all this intel, and then their commandos went in and killed the guards outside that were guarding the facility. So after the guards were killed that Sunday night, the 100 or so Israeli commandos who rappelled down from the helicopters were able to enter the site unchallenged. Using stolen maps, the commandos split into teams, each tasked with destroying a different part of the facility. The raid lasted about 15 minutes. The factory, which is near the city of Masyaf in northwestern Syria, is officially known as the Syrian Scientific Studies and Research Center. But while nominally controlled by the Syrian Ministry of Defense, Western officials say Hezbollah and Iran have taken over operations. It is only about 30 miles from the Lebanese border, which is why Israeli and American officials say Hezbollah manufactures weapons there instead of in Iran. Transporting missiles and weapons from Iran to Lebanon is more than a 1,000-mile odyssey with an array of challenges. So this was extremely interesting that the current war in Lebanon actually kicked off with this highly sophisticated raid in Syria earlier in September, and the Times piece about it is great. I recommend it. That is all the time we have for the news about the news. If you have a story you want us to talk about, email us at wretches@nebulouspodcasts.com and sign up for our newsletter at nebulouspodcasts.com. This has been Ink-Stained Wretches from Nebulous Media, produced this week by Jennifer Hupfel in Colin Chicola's absence. Find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for Wretches.
Is there anything